We're on here.
Mr. Smith, are you there?
Good evening. Happy holidays and welcome to the December 11th, 2024 Southwestern Board of Directors Committee of the Whole meeting. It is 6:32 p.m. and I would like to call this meeting to order. The purpose of this meeting is to conduct the business of the Southwestern School District. We are grateful for all in attendance and those watching at home. Prior to this Committee of the Whole meeting, the board met for an executive session. During this executive session, we discussed students' matters pertaining to both discipline and tuition waivers. Those items can be found on the agenda this evening. We also discussed legal advice received by the Independence Law Center pertaining to 7-Eleven, which is also included on the agenda this evening. Out of respect for all in attendance, please take a moment to silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. And now we stand for the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Mr. Mummert, when you are ready, would you roll call, please, and thank you.
Mrs. Bauer.
Here.
Mr. Beard. Mrs. Brennan.
Here.
Mr. Galzella.
Here.
Mr. Gelsinger.
Here.
Mr. Leidy.
Here.
Mr. Plessick.
Here.
Mr. Smith.
He's calling my cell to join the meeting here in a second.
Mrs. Weaver.
Here.
7 present, one phone, 1 absent.
Matt, are you there?
Yes.
All right. You want to say present, please?
Present.
Mr. Beard did let us know that he would not be able to make the meeting this evening. And also, just as a note, Ms. Brennan will be leaving us at 8 o'clock if we are not finished. And next, we will be moving on to a presentation from the music department. Give them a second to get set up. As is traditional, in the past, the music department has come to what was the December planning meeting. We no longer have a December planning meeting. We have a committee of the whole meeting. So we're very excited to have them come back this evening and perform for us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yes, please.
Is it on?
Yes.
It's on? All right. Thanks for having me. My name is Bill Kirsch. I have the pleasure of being the director of bands at the high school. And I have 3 of our students with us tonight. It's a busy week. It's concert week. But I guilted 3 of these individuals to come on with us. You're going to hear from them a little bit individually, and then they're going to play something together. These 3 students, along with 2 other students, traveled with me this past Saturday to Eastern New York High School to audition for district band. And all 3 of these individuals, and as I said, 2 others who couldn't be with us tonight, qualified for district band, which will be held the end of January. And this year's festival is at Lampeter Strasburg High School. So I thought it would be great if they played a little selection of what their audition material was for you. So the first victim, our first individual is Mr. Joel Worley playing the French horn. So I'm gonna let him come up and play. Should I turn this off, or do you think it'll be okay? Okay, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Next is Ben Horn on trombone. Joel that played for you first is a junior. Ben is a senior. And I'll talk about their accomplishments a little bit in between when we set up. Our last solo performer, some of you may know. His dad knows a couple people here. This is Mr. Zach Friel. Zach is a sophomore. A little bit about while he's getting set up, the district band, our Pennsylvania Music Educators Association district encompasses 7 counties. Both Joel and Ben play 6th on their respective instrument, which is amazing. Mr. Friel here placed number 1 overall with a score of 92.75 out of 100. So he did okay. Rob said, try and improve it next year, but we'll let Zach play. While they're coming up, they're going to do a short little number together. Shameless plug, this Saturday and Sunday are the high school concerts. I know that many of you have or had students that came through the program, so you're aware. You will hear these 3 on the concert. And so we thought, we're always up for a shameless plug. So tickets still available for both shows. But this is a piece called A Christmas Fantasy. So I'll let them take it away. Thank you so much for having us. We'll clear our way out. And as I said, tickets still available for this weekend. So if you need the link, let us know. But
And
thank you
they're
again.
not available at the door, correct?
They can be.
They
They can be.
okay.
Yeah.
If there's seats left.
If there are seats
If there are
left.
seats
Yeah.
left, if
Yeah.
it doesn't sell out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Generally, there will be.
Thank you
That's what-
so much.
Best part about the ticket price is?
Free. Just reserve seating. So
Thank
Mr.
you
Kirk,
so
before you
much.
leave, I do want to give you guys a shout out and thank you for everything you do in the community as well. I mean, we see you in the parades, the Christmas tree lighting at the square the other week, and I know it was cold and our students always perform well. So, and I look forward to the day my daughter sounds like that because we're not quite there yet. So you got your work, you have your work ahead of you.
I am legitimately winded just watching that. That was amazing.
well, thank you.
Thank those
Thank you.
gentlemen again.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that was very festive. Wonderful. All right. Recognition of visitors would be next. We have 2 visitors that have signed in. Neither has notated that they wanted to speak on any agenda items. So we are going to move on then to number 7, which is Crabtree, Rohrborough and Associates Feasibility Study Update Presentation.
Oh, we're not, okay, I got you.
Okay, so we're going to present a few things that we've been working on for the past month. We were here about a month ago, talk about our process. We've kind of gone through some of that, and we want to advance to the next slide. So we're going to talk about existing building usage and capacity. That's as you use the buildings today. We talk a little about the district demographics, the enrollment projections, and some housing data information. Then we'll finish up with scheduled next steps. So next slide. So talk about building capacities. And as we talked at our first meeting, this is, and you can go to the next slide. This is looking at how you use the buildings today. So this is just a snapshot. We talked before, there might be some inefficiencies. You might have a full-size classroom being used as a small group instruction. We'll get into that a little bit later, but this is just looking at a snapshot of how you use the building today. So at the elementary level, it's pretty simple to calculate capacity. Essentially, every kid is in a homeroom or a general classroom all the time. They might go out for art and music, but essentially the general classrooms are what get capacity. So here you'll see, and I'll just kind of outline this. You'll have this presentation to look at in more detail. I'll just outline what the colors represent. Blue is general classroom, green is special ed, orangish color is intervention, and the cyan kind of shows up almost as white on this is kind of those specials, art, music, and then purple is any multi-purpose cafeteria stage, things like that, and then the pink is administrative spaces. Yellow circulation, and gray is support. So elementary, kind of once again, really straightforward. You can go to the next slide. We calculate, we use PDE standards, and PDE uses 25 students per classroom. So when we use that capacity, we know where how many kindergarten through 5th grade classrooms you have. We'll simply apply that 25 students per classroom and get a total PDE capacity. You'll see there at the bottom left of 650. Now we do understand that some of your target class sizes, so you have as a district, you say, hey, and most districts do, if there's lower grade levels, we don't want to put 25 kids in a classroom. So you have a target capacity of actually 22 students for kindergarten through 2nd grade. So on the right-hand side, you'll see what we call the Southwestern School District capacity of 611. You'll see below that a utilization rate. We all know that when you look at any elementary building, you're not going to split up kindergarten, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd exactly the same number of students. So there's a utilization rate of, you're going to have your bubbles. You're not going to be able to, perfectly divide that pie among 25 students per classroom. So we apply utilization rate. So we get what we call a utilization target, which is a more realistic kind of target capacity. So you'll see that below at 585, and for the PDE capacity, and 550 for the school district capacity. And so this will be common. We'll kind of quickly go through the rest of these slides, but this will be common as we go through each of your elementary schools. So go to the next slide. So this is Bearsville, pretty similar one-story layout with K to 5 and the associated special ed learning support. If you go to the next slide. So you'll see Bearsville has a PDE capacity of 600, Southwestern School District capacity of 564. Next slide. West Manheim, this is a 2-story building. And if you go to the next slide. And this one you'll see, this is one of your larger schools. We do have quite a bit more special education in this building. So we'll get into that as we dive into the next step of educational program, begin to understand what happens in each one of those spaces. But this one has a PD capacity of 625 and a Southwestern capacity of 589. And finally, Manheim, your smallest of their schools, has a PD capacity of 300 and Southwestern of 282. Okay, so this will all, yeah, go ahead.
Just a question while we're on the map.
Sure.
There. All of the areas that you've selected for special education are current special education.
Correct.
And
Yep.
not possible or probable.
Right.
Because that's going to make a significant difference in those numbers.
Right. And so I think that's a very key point, because once again, this is how you're using the building. We talked before, you might have a full-size classroom that has 15 kids in it, it could be a small group instruction. However, there's no other place to put them. So you have to use that. So we want to get a snapshot of how you use it. What does that capacity look at? But when we start to look at the next steps, your needs assessment, and look at the options, we're going to come back and say, hey, we could take 2 or 3 of those small group, or 2 or 3 of those full-size classrooms and make them smaller classrooms and now increase the capacity. But of course, the only way to do that is through a construction project or, adding walls. So as we evaluate those options and the next steps of the needs assessment, that capacity might change. We might increase the capacity by making things a little bit more efficient.
And what you're showing now is current.
Current usage, yep.
I have one question. You want me to hold it to the end, or you're?
No, go ahead.
So if we could go back to capacity, I'm curious why our target for grades 3, 4, and 5 is 25 instead of 22.
Yeah, so, and Dr. Burkhart can, go ahead.
So typically, when you get into the upper elementaries, you can have a larger class size because of the instruction strategies that are used and the reading, some of the needs of the kids. They become a little more independent. So smaller class size and lower grades lends itself to more individualized instruction. Not that that doesn't happen at the upper grades, it does, but the needs of the kids become more independent, and that's why you get a little bit of a larger class size. Those are guidelines. They're not hard and fast. Those are ideal.
Yeah, that's if we're going to base everything off of this capacity, I have to start with our target for class sizes. When you get to 25, I think we're underserving our students, because the size 25, when you get the teachers trying to manage a class of 25, the challenges are much more significant. So I want to come back to, I don't want to just derail your presentation, but at 25 as a target, I think is too high. But
Yeah, and I think that's all established, internally with the district and how what kind of goals you want to set. But,
Yeah,
certainly.
and 20, obviously it's the pleasure of the board, but keep in mind, now you have a staffing issue too. So it's not just a construction issue, it's a staffing issue. And when some of our classes now are more than 25, and I don't disagree with you. I think, research will tell you 17, 18 is where you should be, especially in your lower grades, but 14 even, but that becomes a staffing and an issue with staffing as well. So the board can put forward whatever guidelines and we build it off of that. These are what we generally operate by currently. And that's why we gave the numbers to Crabtree to sort of build our capacity based on that. But as you said earlier, that's subject to change based on the wants and needs of the district.
and that's where I wanted to broach that now, because I'd like us to design towards a lower number than 25. I think it speaks to test scores. It speaks to teacher retention. It speaks to any number of issues. When you get into 25 to 27 per class or higher, if we're going to spend money on our schooling, sizing it so that the teachers are less challenged and the kids get more individualized instruction, that's where we should be spending our money. So at the very least, I'd like us to see another option that includes a lower class size in the feasibility study.
Yeah, sure. We can discuss that with the administration. And essentially what that's going to flush out as far as the facility study is going to be, in the end, based on the enrollment projections and how much space you have, is going to be the number of classrooms you need. And you'll see that towards the end when we get to the enrollment projections, where you stand currently with your current usage and using the current capacities that we have. So,
Thank you. I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt your
no,
presentation.
okay. Moving on to the secondary, the equation is very similar, but how we get there is a little different. The kids, we're now on a schedule. Every room can be occupied at the same time. So we now starting to get capacity for all of the, the tech ed, the music, the art, all those specialized spaces. The gymnasium now gets capacity, your large group instructions, because we now can schedule those kids in different areas. And if you go to the next slide, so there's a 2-story Markle, but one more. So you'll see the career tech ed, the art and music now get capacity, media center, classroom, things like that. So we now have a capacity of 1,531 for PDE, and the district doesn't have any different guidelines for class size for targets at the secondary level than what PDE has. So we just have that one column. But you'll see the utilization rate changes a little bit, just because you might have an AP science that might have 10 kids in it in one period, and the next period is full. with a general science, or you might have Latin or something like that it's not going to fill a full classroom, or you might have tech ed spaces that we say, hey, for a safety standpoint, we don't want to put 25 in there. So that utilization rate goes from 90 at the elementary to 85% at the secondary for those reasons. And once again, these utilization rates are actually from PDE guidelines and standards. When PD was doing reimbursable projects, there was a process called PlanCon that you go through, and they had calculations that would do capacity in the 85% of the secondary and the 90% at the primary level or elementary level was their guidelines. So go on to the high school. Similar scenario at the secondary level. We now get more spaces that have capacity. So one more slide. And this represents the final build out, so to speak, of the high school. So we have a total PD capacity at the high school of 1,939. Any questions on capacity before I turn it over to Fred, who's going to get into demographics and enrollment?
Just one question.
Sure.
Is there anything taken into accountability as far as how many kids that may be in a learning support classroom where the classroom may be allocated for 30, but due to how it's being utilized, you're only allowed to have 10?
Yeah.
Or whatever the numbers may be.
So good question. On the learning support and special education side, PDE actually does not give capacity to those spaces. So if you saw through all of our charts where we might have autistic support or reading specialists, there is no designated capacities for those. So when we go to look at the capacity of the building, that doesn't take those spaces into consideration because there's so many variables. For one, a lot of those spaces aren't used full time. They might be pull out spaces or push in. And those are kids that would like take the elementary level. You know, the reading specialist might be pulling out a first grader and a second grader. Well, we're not going to give that capacity because they're coming from a classroom that already has that capacity. So you can't like double dip, so to speak, on those spaces. Sometimes we'll get into, if we want to, adding for the full-time special education spaces, like an autistic classroom, we could look at adding capacity for that, even though PDE doesn't, if there's a desire to do that. But it's not going to equate to too much because, you know, there's certain standards on the square foot and how big that space is per number of students. And once again, those are the types of spaces that one year you might have one or two students in there. The next year you might have more, and it's really difficult to assign capacity to those and kind of paint an accurate picture. So
Based on the numbers you have there, if we were to put the numbers for the special ed, autistic classrooms, whatever it may be, into those numbers that you have, then our utilization rate would drop. If they're not taking into accountability for anything. Is that what you're saying?
well, the capacity, if you were to put them, you're saying add capacity for those classrooms?
Correct.
Well, your utilization rate is always going to be the same ratio. The utilization rate deals with the fact that you can't schedule everything perfectly and fit 25, every period you can't fit 25 kids in every classroom. The capacity would basically increase if you added capacity to those rooms, but you need somewhere to teach those.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just curious if it was taken in, I just want to make sure we weren't saying we have 30 seats for students, but in all reality, we can only use it for 10.
Right.
Because then that's giving us false data.
Right, I want to dovetail on that. So in recently, in conversation with special education and our redistricting, we covered that there's a prohibition there's a number of feet we have to allow every special ed child by law to educate them. We're restricted in the amount of space we could take from them. I forget do you recall? Right.
Yeah.
Are we baking that into our max capacity number, or is that, it's not a requirement of PDE, if I'm understanding you correctly?
Well, no. So that is a Department of Education requirement on
Okay.
the number of square foot per student. So in other words, if you had an autistic classroom, you can't put 25 students
Right.
in there because you're limited by the square footage. But once again, those spaces are not assigned any capacity to our calculation. So in other words,
But if we end up giving more space, then that's going to take space away
Yes,
from us.
correct.
Which, let's face it, that's where we're headed.
Correct.
Or if you take two side-by-side, full-size learning support rooms. Cut one room in half, put both of the learning supports in a small group room. Now you go up by 25.
Yeah.
Because the other room can be returned to regular. And that's why it's important, as Scott said, to understand where you are as a baseline.
Correct.
And then you can start to, maybe adjust before you have a.
You want to hop back,
So-
maybe the
So we
second-
are adjusting that capacity down depending on the requirements by PDE.
If they take it from, yes.
Well, I think it's more, so if, maybe a good example, just we look at one of the floor plans. So just take the high school, for example. So if you were to say, hey, we need a multiple disabilities classroom for special education, we're gonna have to take over one of those classrooms. Now your capacity for that school dropped 25 because you're taking over a classroom. On the inverse side of things, if you say, hey, we have these two intervention rooms that are full-size classrooms, but we could deal with them in small group instructions. Let's move, as Fred said, let's move two of those green spaces out into two smaller spaces. Now we freed up two classrooms. Now we have 50 more capacity. So none of the green spaces on there or the orange spaces currently have capacity when we do our calculation. Only the blue and the kind of light blue spaces.
Meaning they don't add to the number of capacity when you say they don't have capacity.
Right. Meaning, yeah.
Okay.
But if we gave more space to that
Yes.
department, then we would lose
Yes.
capacity.
And that's actually
We
one of
all
our,
know that's
That's
gonna be a
right.
never-ending thing.
yeah, and that's one of the things that our next step is to talk educational program. Not only what is your educational program today, let's understand it, but what are the goals of the future? There's a big tendency across the state of pulling out, trying to do as much as you can within the district and not sending kids to the IU. I don't know how much you do that now. We'll begin to understand that as we talk to your special ed director, but are we going to be doing that in the future? Or do you foresee the need of, where do you need more autistic, or where do you need more life skills or things like that? And we'll understand that. And that'll be a need that we now plug into the equation. Without an addition, that means the capacity goes down to satisfy those needs.
Good evening. I'm Fred Witham. I haven't been here before. I actually did work on your study when you were planning the high school, but I was just new and behind the scenes. Prior to coming to Crabtree Rorbon Associates, I spent 35 years in public education, finishing my career at Cumberland Valley as a superintendent. Along the way, I picked up my doctorate degree, which was in school planning, and I taught at Shippensburg University for over a decade. Aspiring superintendents, the facility use course. So it's just kind of a natural fit after I retired to do this. So let me go over your demographics with you. Please stop me, ask me any questions along the way. This is almost as confusing sometimes as capacity. So just chime in and I can answer any questions the best that I can. So if you go to the next slide. This is just an overall snapshot. One of the things that we're using is a software package and analytic package called Esri, and the package specifically is Business Analyst. So this is a geographic-driven analysis based on census blocks. And if you have a census block that crosses outside of your district boundary, it prorates the size of that census block, comes up with a pretty darn accurate representation of the kinds of things that have happened. And then in some cases, you'll see they're projecting forward as to what's likely to happen. The one thing that I would call out to you on this slide is that you could see that your population was climbing just to about the pandemic. And then you see it start to level off and drop a little. Again, not much. If you look at the axis on the side, you see it's only going up by 200 each time. So the trail is the story is, at least right now, you're starting to level off. If you'll go to the next slide and the next one. So just some background. This is your 20-year enrollment history. Those are actual enrollments reported to PDE, including the one that was reported for this school year, required to be sent in October. And you can see that you've had some ups and downs, but you're pretty close to that trend line in most cases. You did have a COVID dip in 2021, like everybody did, but I will tell you that you rebounded a heck of a lot faster than most districts in the region and the state. And you can see that by 2 years later, you were at an all-time high enrollment for that 20 years. Next slide, please. Here is the breakout by elementary. And these are your class sizes since 2015-16 all the way forward. I go back that far because that's those are the years that we're drawing data from to make projections moving forward. You can see that COVID dip in 2021 in your elementary population, and it climbs back up in 22-23 with the district as a whole. But then it drops back down to numbers that you were experiencing in 2019-20. And it actually, if you take the 3 years impacted most by COVID, 2021 to 22-23, and average those 3 years, you actually end up with an average of those 3 years pretty close to where you've been, that 1950-ish kind of range. Next slide. Yes, go ahead.
So real quick,
back.
before you go any further with numbers, that depicts the enrollment that we currently have or did have each year.
Can you go back a slide? Yes, that is K-5 enrollment.
Does that
Each
take
year.
into consideration homeschool kids, private school kids, charter school kids, cyber school, anything like that?
It does.
So would it be safe to say that possibly during COVID, the reason we saw some of those dips is the number of kids that left our school district for other reasons?
Yes, correct.
So can we somehow see those numbers baked into this where if potentially all those kids came back to school, could we house all of those kids?
I would not have access to that information. The reasons that students withdraw or enroll is district. You would
Well, we track
probably,
homeschool kids, correct, Dr. Burkhart?
Yes, we do. Can we house them all? We don't have a choice. We would. But it would probably obviously it would make classes tighter. We probably have well over 100 homeschools and probably well over close to, just remember, we have what, 100 or more kids in the cyber school? 200. So
We're trying to counter reports at the end of the year.
I would say we'd probably look at about 400 kids coming back.
So in comparison to 2020, what was the numbers like back then?
Well, they're pretty much the same. Our homeschool went up after COVID, and it's leveled off some, but it's still higher than it was before COVID. And I think our cyber school has been pretty much maintained.
My fear is like, this doesn't show the true increase in number of students that we have in our district. This is just showing the enrollment we have in our school. Is it truly showing the population increase that we have?
that number we can show you.
Okay.
We can show you now its total number of kids like 0 to 5 years of age, 6 to 12 years of
Okay.
age. Whether we can also probably then from your enrollment figure out what percentage of them are not attending your school and kind of reverse engineer it to have an idea. You know, in the years that I've been doing this, that's a question that comes up a lot. The trend has faithfully been that more kids are leaving than ever returning. The big return issues come when you have often a parochial school that closes, and all of a sudden everybody from wherever, St. Peter's, St. Joe's is back in the mainstream of things.
Dr. Witham, I think when you go further on, I think you'll also show that our growth tends to be, excuse me, secondary,
It does.
which when they come back from parochial or they want to participate in extracurricular activities.
Or regionally, you need to get a little bit of equity built in a starter house that might be in another district at a lower price. And then you build the equity to get your second house here and you bring your kids over in middle school and high school. As a matter of fact, if you go to the next slide, you could actually go, that's the K-5, go to the next one. You can see here that your middle school student body is actually one of your bigger groups, particularly in the past couple of years. And look how quickly they rebounded and surpassed. And they dropped a little after that COVID. But if I remember correctly, your largest class is currently 7th grade in the middle school. So they're tracking through. As a matter of fact, you must have had a couple of bubble years come through, and most of those kids have now started to reach the middle school and the high school. And the elementary numbers are tracking a little bit lower.
That's the wrong slide. We don't have 1,900 kids in our middle school. I think the slide might.
It says elementary on your chart.
Oh, I'm sorry, go to the next
Yeah.
one. Go to the next one. Nope, I'm sorry, it's the wrong slide.
But the high school's
It's wrong.
right, so you can go off of that one.
Yeah. Well, and you can see what happens at the high school here. You can see, look how big your class sizes have gotten, and it's not like it's up and down. You've just kept on going there.
So,
Can I,
go ahead.
keeping this slide in mind, can we go back to the elementary? And can I offer something that we might think about? That one's fine. So the spike in 2022, obviously I think all of us it's the kind of thing that's throwing us off. Have we considered that there is a flex place where a month or two where you can send your kids, you can opt to send your kids or not send your kids? And the possibility that in 2020 during COVID, a lot of parents opt out of sending their kindergartner and then opted in the next year, but those kindergartners held out as well. And then the next year, all of those parents sent all their children, and that would due to the spike and then correcting the next year.
Yes.
Do you understand? Does that make
Yes,
sense?
and if you have schools that have a private first grade, during those COVID years, a lot of parents decided that rather than go with the uncertainty of what this next year is going to bring yet, we're going to pay one more year's tuition, see what happens, and then bring them back. So you're absolutely right. That could have been just, a spring that was coiled, ready to go, and it just took 3 years for it to.
So that
catch itself
2022
up.
number could be completely misleading by that. If we were to, is there a way to research that, do you think, or?
Well,
Dr.
that's
Burkhart
why I mentioned taking the average of those 3 years and kind of considering them as one event.
Yeah,
And then I think you're kind of back to where you were,
leveled off.
yeah, as a whole.
Because that corresponds more to the high school where you would not have had that.
Yes.
And it was a trajectory up and then level off.
Yes. Yes. And actually the kindergarten enrollment is on the next slide. And you can, and again, because kindergarten is back, so 2021 is purple. You've got more, now it's close. I mean, you can see there's definitely a slowing of incoming elementary students.
No, I'm going to challenge you on that if I may.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm jumping the gun, but housing market, is that coming up in your future slides here? Because,
There is.
okay, I'll wait till we get there then.
Okay.
'cause-
But the other takeaway is, again, if you want to net this whole 5 years, you only gained 1 student by total numbers of bodies over the course of those from 1920 to 24-25. And we can catch back up to the high school then. So there's the high school. There's your class sizes. That was your, in terms of grade alignments, the high school has been your biggest gain in the past 5 years. And again, it may have some COVID. We had kids who left. They really decided they liked to work. They were making money, and then they realized that money in terms of the lifestyle I want isn't enough. I better go back while I'm still eligible. So we've seen some things regionally with some of the high school classes bumping around. But I don't think that's enough to account for total in-migration of 82 students over the same time when your elementary is only bringing in 1 additional student over that 5-year period. Hence, whoever brought up the point earlier that you probably have students that are more in secondary schools that are moving into the district than elementary schools, at least in this time frame in the data. If you go to the next slide, this is your average class sizes for this school year as reported to PDE. I did not take the average of kindergarten and first just for the reasons that we discussed, because these parents have other options. But you can see that the high school is the largest average class size at 346. The elementary's second to fifth grade is 342. You got to remember that that difference is time, the total number of grades. So while your averages are pretty close, which helps to the reliability of your enrollment projections, there is definitely a change between those grade alignments, kindergarten through fifth, and then ninth through 12th. One of the things that's been challenging, no matter who's doing your demographics, is managing how do you account for COVID. It's getting easier because now we're getting further and further away from the pandemic years, but these are the actual growth rates year to year on average. 5 years prior to the pandemic, you were growing at 0.9% per year in kindergarten, where now you can see since the pandemic. And remember, you gotta look through the right lens, because that COVID dip is in there, but it still is offset by those 2 years that followed. You're still you're shrinking considerably at the kindergarten level. You've gone from less than 1% to almost minus 1%. That has a huge compounding effect as these kids move through the buildings. You can also see that overall K to 12, you actually have gone up overall district wide, and what's accounting for that? It's that large number of students that moved into the high school, because your high school enrollment has gone up, what, fourfold, fivefold since the pandemic ended. So if you go to the next slide, so here's what we did, and this ties back to the part that Scott was talking about earlier. If you take all of those capacities as you are currently using your buildings, you have 5,645 seats. It is impossible to schedule every classroom full every period every day. So the dark blue line, which is the second horizontal line down with the 4907 next to it, that's how many students out of 5,645 seats you can likely schedule efficiently and deliver the district's program. Based on the average of the enrollment projections, so we took PDE's enrollment projection, we took a enrollment projection that we did based on your growth rates 5 years prior to the pandemic and 5 years after the pandemic. And then we took the average of PDE and the two that we're talking about that we did, and that's the 4375 line, the yellow line, out to 2930. If you go back, yep. So with knowing that if you're going to anticipate 4,375 students, and knowing that you have, every school has scheduling inefficiencies, in order to schedule 4,375 students, you need 4,813 seats. That's 10% more than your projected enrollment 5 years from now. That's the green line. You're good as long as the green line is below the blue line. But remember, this is district. So now we've got to look at understanding, do you have the right seats in the right place?
I think you're gonna go right into it.
Okay.
I'll save it for later.
So if you go to the next slide. There we go. So here's the high school. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it. you can see that you're anticipated to go to 1436. You're going to need 1,579 seats. And basically you have 80, 90 more seats anticipated than you need. And remember, the blue line is still, and at the high school level, it's 15% below the red line. So it's not like you're full at 1649. That's the sweet spot. That's exactly where you want to plan to be in 5 years. If you go to the next slide, we'll work our ways
Can I
down
pause
through.
you there for a second?
Sure.
So we have a horizontal line for anticipated enrollment projections. We're not accounting for housing market at all. If we have a flat line, because housing goes up and down.
Housing, yes, but these projections are based on your enrollments that are impacted by the housing market. So any house that's sold and brought in new students, those students are baked into the formula as you look forward, as you project forward.
How does that include new construction?
That includes new construction at the same rate it was being built during the time. So when we did your high school enrollment projections, we did a housing analysis, and we determined that we needed to add 6 students per grade level per year in order to account for housing that was not baked into the projections already. And you'll see some of this on another slide as you move forward. You're averaging 0.37 students per household, per housing unit. I'm sorry, not per household, per housing unit. So if you ever want just a very rough, quick calculation, take a housing development, multiply the number of units times 0.37, and that's how many students it should drive out. Again, on average, if you have a housing development that's a lot of one-bedroom apartments, you're not going to get to 0.37. If you have a lot of houses in that $350,000, $200,000 kind of sweet spot, which may not be new, they may be existing residential properties that are turning over, then you're going to get probably more than the 0.37. But as a general rule of thumb, historically, you've been at 0.37 for many years.
Yeah, and I think another thing to point out real quick, that 5-year, that the reason the green line is flat is because we're looking, what is the projected enrollment 5 years and adding 10% to that. So that's just a static line because it's a 5-year out projection. We don't want to project any further than that because, no one has a crystal ball that clear, so. But anyway, that green line, so all the multicolored lines below that show the different projections and the increases. And then that green line is just a static point 5 years out plus 10%.
So I think the point Mr. Galzello is trying to ask is, did you guys discuss this with the townships and ask how many
Well,
houses?
I'd like to
the
get into
permits
my
are pulled
points,
and-
but I think
Yeah,
you're going to get into it, right?
We're gonna get
Okay.
we're gonna get there. So
I have a
we'll go
bunch
through
of
these.
questions in that
We'll
regard.
go through these quick if you go to the next. So want to make sure that I can be crystal clear about this. That is the black part of the line is your historic enrollment. Those are students that we knew were here. Currently, you have 1,384 students. If you take the average growth rate prior to the pandemic and after the pandemic, and you apply that growth rate to 1,384, it produces a trend line. It doesn't produce a projection. If it takes that 1,384 and it adds whatever, 1% every year, 1%, 1%, 1%. You could have a class move in that is 2% smaller or 2% larger, and the actual enrollment over 5 years, if we come back and chart it, mathematically should be above that line, below that line, on that line, and that's just projecting the trend. So based on what's happened pre and post pandemic, your high school as a grade alignment is anticipated to continue to climb. The better projection as to how many are going to climb, how much is on that previous slide. But I think it's not as important at the at the high school level. You're going to see it becomes increasingly important when we get to the elementary level. Next slide. Here's the middle school projections. Again, there's your green line. There's where you have a number of seats that are available still. We still want to kind of work on your capacity. Middle schools tend not to schedule efficient as elementary schools or high schools. I mean, that's pretty close. Remember, again, we're at 1254 is 85% of the total capacity. So even if your 1148 gets all the way up to 1284, you're only 85% filled. And that gives you long enough of a runway to plan if you were to encounter unanticipated growth. And there's the straight line projection indicating again that, based on the other graph that we just showed you, it's got validity. It's likely going to continue up in that trend. And then here now, look what happened to your green line and your blue line. Your average projected enrollment looks a little more wonky than the middle school and high school. The lines aren't as tight. And the reason that is we know kids who have already come here and are attending who are now going to go to middle school or high school. These projections, regardless if it's Crabtree Rohrbaugh or PDE or some third-party firm, has to determine a rate for your incoming kindergarten classes. And the difference in the methodology of calculating incoming kindergarten classes is really the basis for the spread in those lines that you see. We're taking the average and we're saying you should anticipate 1,896 students in 5 years at the elementary level, which require 2,085 seats to schedule at 10% above that number. You only have 1,958 seats at 90%. So you are anticipated to have a shortfall at your elementary level between 1958 and 2085, which would be 120 some odd, 130 some odd students. So you're 4 or 5-ish classrooms short. Now, that's where, again, going back to what Scott's talking about and understanding your capacity and how you're going to use your buildings. If you could reclaim 4 classrooms that currently have 0 capacity and still meet the legal and moral needs and the board adopted curriculum for educating students, you're good. I mean, you can probably reclaim a lot of those spaces. I think the key takeaway is, at least right now, I don't think that you need to be planning another elementary school. You need to really decide. You're going to need to watch it closely, particularly this close to the Maryland border. Back to your housing. Your average cost of a house is 60% of what it costs to buy a house in Maryland. And you're getting that flow of people that are moving up into this area because they can maintain their jobs and zip across the border and work in the other state.
I want to dovetail into that.
Sure.
That's exactly one of the points I wanted to get to. So included in that, it's my understanding that the new incoming administration is going to lift the restriction on tenants requiring landlords to pay back mortgages. And the result is going to be a switch to a buying market, because as those houses get foreclosed on, you're going to see a vast influx, as well as we continue to see inflation. To your point, with our housing being cheaper than in Maryland, you're going to see a big influx of people who are moving here simply to make ends meet because it's more expensive over the line. When you couple that with the building that we have, the rampant building that we have going here, I postulate we're going to have a large housing increase here. And we've seen that in our last redistricting discussion, that the number of housing. So that's the calculations I'd like to drill down on.
That's complicated to quantify because it's an event that hasn't happened. you don't want to invest and over and build, but you don't want to underinvest and then short kids as they're coming through the educational system.
Well, to your point on overbuilding, right? If we're overbuilding and we're shooting for a class size of 25, I can tell you right now, we're at 27 in a lot of places or more. So overbuilding allows us that space to have smaller class sizes, which is that the benefit there is far better than being on the other end of it, where we're making our class sizes grow and redistricting every year.
Yes. And again, that's something that is a burden for board members, because ultimately we can give you all these numbers and you can go through it, but you're very much in tune with things that can't be necessarily quantified easily. And then you have to decide, yeah, we like that, but we think we better do 2% more space, or the equivalent of 3 fewer students in a classroom. And then we can put that into these tables and we can draw out and say, okay, you were 5 classrooms short, now you're 12 classrooms short. And then you're going to, you're going to have to look at your financing and everything else and find that balance that makes you feel comfortable in your responsibility for educating children and keeping control of expenses for your taxpayers.
Because we're not at those target numbers. You're suggesting 25. We have, I know here in the middle school, we're above 25 in a multitude of places, right? So we also have to bake in coming down from 27 into our calculations.
That would be included in here. Baked into here is bringing everything to 25. If you
Okay.
want to break it down to even further, then you would say these are our new target numbers at each grade level, and then we could just put them in and everything will spill through the graphs and show you what you end up needing at the end. So before I go through these, and so that I don't forget to mention this, because I think it's really important. We're talking a lot about the things that cause the district to grow. One of the things that we really haven't talked about is existing housing. New housing developments they get a lot of like spotlights on them, but they're really not as formidable as the housing market of existing homes. And that's one of the things that we want to really kind of also clue in on. Given the age of your population, you have a lot of existing homes that are likely to come on the market in the next, 10 to 15 years, and maybe at a rate that they haven't been on the market before. You currently, and I've been spot checking for the past couple of months, you have anywhere between 125 and 175 homes being listed for sale, new and existing, in, Zillow, Trulia, and, the Remax and all those other ones that put out those numbers. That doesn't mean every house brings a kid, but I think we've got to keep that in mind. The other thing that's also kind of sits off in the background is you also have out migration. You have people who are moving in from Maryland, but you also have people moving out to other states. You have kids who are coming through the system. Their parents love the area. The kids graduate, but they're not moving for another 30 years. So, when you look at, oh my, we've got these houses coming in, you also have to look at how many people that you have going out in that out migration. Again, that's kind of baked into these. I don't anticipate your out migration as a percentage of your population is going to change much, but it's something that we really need to keep an eye on. I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are the same straight line projections for each of the elementary schools. They're the same kind of thing that we were talking about. What this does begin to tell you, and you look at, if you go back one, I'm sorry, you can start to see the difference as to what elementary schools are going to be anticipating growth and which ones are going to be flat. So, there's a school that that attendance unit should probably continue to anticipate growth as time goes on, as opposed to the next slide, where here's one where you're pretty much projected to run along where you were. And you can
Do
just,
you possibly have any indication where the previous one where Bearsville, where that increase is coming from? Because we've discussed at length that they're out of room to grow in that district area. So it's a lot of that.
Turnover houses,
Turnover.
I would guess, particularly if they're
And
older
that's a
homes.
steep,
and they're
that's a
that
steep increase compared to a lot of the other ones for an area that has no new houses whatsoever, but.
Yep, and look, you've got them, it'd be interesting. I spent too much time in academia. It would be interesting to see the housing market against that. Because if that's built out, then they've got to be moving into existing homes that are turning over from.
To Mr. Lay's point, if in the future presentations, if we could get a clearer indication of your projections and your numbers for migration in and out, I think that would be beneficial, because that's one of my biggest concerns is in each school area, that level of housing incoming and outgoing, and what your calculations are there.
Well, I mean, the calculations are representation of the enrollment. So enrollment goes up, enrollment goes down. Again, you may be able to query your, or you may even want to do a survey. When I was at CV, we did a big survey, particularly to all the new parents. Why did you come? Where did you come from? What attracted you to the Cumberland Valley School District? And a whole bunch of questions. Did you buy a new house? Did you move in because of did you come to the area for a new job, a significant other, a lifestyle change, whatever. And that was very, very telling. But that's not information that I'm necessarily going to be able to query
Right,
through.
and Dr., to your point, that's where my concern falls, is that in that specific areas where we often fall short in being able to dial in locally the housing effects locally for each school, because we get into this disparity, like you showed, where different elementaries have different levels, and that's specific to our housing in those areas. And then we wind up in a redistricting scenario where we don't have room to move into another school because we're already at that max capacity, class size wise.
Right. And I'll show you if you want to flip through.
Okay.
Through these. Keep going. Okay, so one of the things, we had a conversation with the administration and looking at a map saying, where might you slide some kids around? So we thought, well, how about Manheim and West Manheim? Could you potentially consider that one big attendance unit, resplit the kids between the two buildings? And the answer is no. You're anticipated to have slightly more students. Well, the answer is maybe. For the next 5 years, you probably could. But look, in 5 years, you're just basically right at that 90%. So you're not going to redistrict your way between those two. And if you go to the next slide, here is West Manheim again, but it's with Bearsville and Park Hills. And you can see, again, there's where your growth is. Your green line is actually, as a collection of schools, projected to be greater than the total number of seats that you have in that area. And again, you're not going to be able to match the numbers exactly between the other projections and these, because these are the straight line projections. So it could be a little bit worse, it could be a little bit better, but I would be shocked if you ever get down below the target capacity of those three schools combined, even with any kind of margin of error on there. I mean, even if you needed 100 less seats, 200 less seats, you're still above the seats that you have. So if you go to the next slide, and here's what we have so far on the housing units. Now, we've queried the townships. I received notes from the district on their liaison meetings, and we started going through the liaison meeting notes and trying to reconcile it with the last study that we did. But we have not received any information directly back from any of the townships other than, I don't want to get anybody in trouble, what's the one that's not growing at all?
Yeah,
Yeah, they were like,
nobody's moving.
we're not growing, we're not moving, we're good, and it's all in the other ones. So So this is again, census data. And you can see the population, the household and the housing units and your school district enrollment. And I highlighted in yellow, the change in the housing units because we were drawing the data from those particular years. So you can see in those years, you're going from 79 units in a year to 174 units. So it's a sizable increase during that time. You average, if you look across all those years from 2010 to 2021, 0.37 is the average students per residential unit. And even though with all the change that's happened since 2010 to 2021, you really never get more than less than a 1% above or 1% below that 0.37. So the same thing when you look at the students as a percent of the total population, it's very consistent. It's not quite as consistent as housing, but it's pretty close. I mean, you got a 2-3% difference between the high and the low and the average. So, you can then start, again, another way to kind of verify the enrollment projections is to say, what's our projected population? And if students are consistently 37% of that or 14% of that population or 15% of that population, how many students can we expect? And again, it goes back to just being able to validate your other enrollment projections. Next slide, please. So this is again created by Esri, and again they are nationally recognized. The biggest corporations in the country is using their data, and there's a couple of important things to look at here. One is actually we'll answer one of your questions earlier. You're talking about housing that might turn over if laws change. About 17% to 18% of your housing is rental units. So that would be if they 100% of them defaulted and they turned over to not being renters. That's how much you would gain. The
I'm sorry, you said 70% is renters?
17%.
That makes more sense.
Yeah.
Yes. 7.
You can see your population is coming up, and now it's starting to level off. And then by 2029, next 5 years, they're only anticipating a change from 30,869 to 31,818. Your housing units are projected to go from 12,162 to 12,647. So that's 465 additional housing units, averaging 93 per year over the next 5 years. So the question is, are they building houses faster than 93 units per year in the district? And that's the piece that we need to add in. And that's the piece that got us those additional 6 students per grade level in the previous set of projections. I've already mentioned the historic rate of 0.37. In the 5 years prior to the pandemic, you were 116 new residential units per year. That's what's baked into the formula. So we want to check that against what's going to happen in the next couple of years. And there's that fact that you're actually 62% lower as a medium home value here in the district than the whole state of Maryland, which is $457,000 a house. So we've got all the baseline in with no additional increases as a result of housing units. We want to add back in now when we get confirmation on housing units from each of the townships, what that offset is going to be to potentially look at increasing the projected numbers and then seeing where they are against your capacities. And if you go to the next slide. In this is the last year that this data is being reported, but in 2022, this is 2021 to 2022, so it's just 1 year, 3% of your residents, 2.9%, moved into the district from another state. So that's 876 residents in that 1 year. If that's a consistent move, the housing market allows that to continue, then I think you can continue to see people come in from out of state. Next slide. And I'm going to turn it back to Scott, unless you have any general questions for me. Anything else that I can add?
I do have one. I'm sorry, I feel like
No,
I'm
that's-
monopolizing, but so my big concern is looking at overall population versus looking at individual populations in school areas. That's one where I feel like we struggle the most here. Is it all comes together. It's valid for our middle schools and our high schools because obviously all their students are here. But when you separate out for elementary schools, that's the shell game we're playing here with trying to manage our class sizes. So in considering the overall population, I think that hamstrings us in trying to properly adjust our elementary level. To your point, you clearly illustrate that. And that's why I think the best solution to consider moving forward is an intermediate that takes some of that elementary population and puts it in its own space, and then we distribute the rest to that's a good way to rebalance that overall student population. I haven't seen that in any suggestions. I'm asking for that in the considerations that we get.
Redistricting.
Redistricting to including some sort of intermediate schooling scenario attached to a building as opposed to a separate
Oh,
building.
you mean like a center, like a kindergarten center?
If I can give you an
or-
example, we're up for a renovation in one of our elementaries in a few years. The discussion was to expand that elementary,
Oh, and-
turn it into a 4th and 5th grade to take the pressure, but then send those other 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and kindergarten to the other elementaries. And if we were able to expand one of them, turn it into 4th and 5th grade, that would take the pressure off some of the other ones.
That allows us to adjust that overall population, and specifically Park Hills is up next. So that's where we would add on an intermediate and then adjust the remaining among our elementaries, and that way we would be able to adjust the specifics to the overall.
We have two big clients, Carlisle and Chambersburg, that are both growing. And that is that's the strategy they employed. They want to take 1 or 2 grades out of their elementaries,
Mhm.
6th grade out of the middle school, create an intermediate, and then it gives them they're actually in the process too, likely to redistrict and shutter some of their current schools, because when you add on and you do it, you deal with that shift where you've got schools that are empty versus schools that are just overflowing. And what we need to be able to say to you, if you want to consider grade realignment, is we need to fully understand how many students each building will accept based on what you believe you want to do with the spaces in those buildings in the near future. So we've got to go through that exercise of, okay, we're going to take these special ed classes and we're going to move them, or we're going to, divide this room in half, or do whatever. And we could settle in on the final, and we could say, okay, we've got to take 20 kids out of here and 40 kids out of here. Well, what happens if we take the entire 5th grade class out of here, or the entire 6th grade class out of here? And then you can begin to look and see.
And I will
how
tell you,
that
Doctor,
works.
we're doing that annually. I anticipate annually right now to adjust for our class sizes. So I think going forward, I'm going to speak for myself here, staunch supporter that we need an intermediate to stop having to do this every year. That's where I think the answer really lies. And attaching it to our existing elementary allows us the variability on those flex years when we don't get as many. We're still attached to an elementary school, so it's not completely wasted space either. I'd like to see that in our considerations. If anyone else agrees or just,
It's easy to drive out. We just take the projected enrollments by grade level and start moving them to different grades, and then test them against the capacity of those buildings, or
Right.
take your total and say, okay, if you're going to build a 4, 5, 6 building, you need to have, whatever, 1,000 seats in it. go from
And one
there.
benefit for that is, I know that we've seen a significant increase in special ed in the lower grades, but not as much in the higher grades. So if we were to select one building for a 4 or 5 building, then maybe we wouldn't even need an addition there because you'd have less special ed rooms, and then we would disperse them into the other elementary schools. So, you know, if you could run something like that for us, and see how that works out, whether or not it's a new building or expansion, or whether we work out a lot better the way it is.
Right. Well, if, Dr. Burkhardt, if you want to like send me some scenarios that you'd like run, it's not a problem, but you won't see them until after the next step, because to try and tell you how big those buildings would be and the amount of parking and land and everything else that might go with it and what sites might accept it, we've got to figure out how many you can fit in your existing buildings.
Exactly. So that's why I wanted to put it to you as soon as possible so that we don't get too far down one direction, if we're going to consider the other way.
Good. Thank you.
Sorry it took so long.
I appreciate the input. Thank you.
So overall schedule, here we are. This is what we presented before. We're meeting here in December to look at the first information gathering and data analysis. We're going to do the same thing in January. Once again, some of the upcoming tasks, review the educational program, evaluate that against your capacity. Understand that we're also going to be we're walking the buildings with Nate later, the elementary buildings later this week to understand all the existing conditions assessment with our engineers as well. We'll bring that to you back as far as the needs assessment from a facility standpoint and also what it costs to upgrade to current standards. And then we'll have, sounds like some more maybe enrollment information. Certainly, as we get more information from the townships, we can begin to validate, okay, are there, as Fred said, some of those existing historical housing, how many new houses are coming on a year already baked into the projections? Do we project anything that's going to happen above that we need to make adjustments to? We'll report back. Hopefully we've heard back from everybody by then. And then we'll look at also, once we understand the educational program, are there operational efficiencies to gaining some spaces back at each of the spaces at each of the schools. And then, so we'll talk in January, once again, about some high level, making sure we get all the options on the table that we want to study. We already heard some tonight. We'll talk about that in January, begin to work through January, February on those options, bring those options to the board in February to review them and hopefully get to a point where we can make recommendations in March. Next slide. I think that just talks about the next steps I already mentioned. So any final questions for us or any additional information you want to make sure we bring to you guys next month?
Just one interesting number. The one recent projection I heard was 500 houses in Hanover in the next so many years.
Right.
So even if you cut that in half at 300 houses, that's 111 students. That's not accounted for.
Across, yeah, K to 12, yeah.
That's our concern.
Yeah.
So I would rather, I'd like us to tap into our townships and not go off of just Zillow and.
Yeah, and we've made those requests. We just haven't heard back from them.
Is there anything we can do to, we know some of these supervisors. Is there anything we can reach out and help you guys?
I have emailed them, I sent them a form, I have followed up with phone calls, and sometimes they want to hear from local officials for fear it's a vendor or.
We can help with that.
Yeah.
We can
Mr.
help with
Beard,
that.
Superintendent's name in vain.
Mr. Beard's not here tonight. He's our representative for the township, so maybe we'll get him on that. So we'll try to pull some strings and get you some accurate data instead of just Zillow.
Yeah. And the thing that's always difficult, doing this for so many years and is, what are the things, we worked in districts where we've updated their study maybe, 5 or 6 times over 15 years. And we'll hear the same housing project that's planned that hasn't been built for 15 years. So we'll have to decipher, all right, what are actual shovels in the ground ready homes versus the ones that, hey, this development might or might not happen within 5 or 10 years. So,
But the people that live around here will tell you,
right,
if you drive on some of these back roads, It's coming.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
hard to say it's not coming.
Okay, thanks for your time.
Everybody good to keep moving forward?
Will you guys' brief be sent out to us? Can we get a copy of that? Does Jeff have it? Okay. Thank you.
Put it on the website as well,
Okay.
And it has your names as well. I don't believe I caught the doctor's last name.
with them.
With them.
With them? Thank you, sir. I appreciate all the analysis.
Great
Any
presentation.
questions, just, send the suit. You can forward them to me and I'll get you back answers as quickly as I can.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Are there any additions, deletions, or modifications to the agenda? You good? Okay. All right. So the next section is hearings of persons who wish to address the board. I'd like to read something before we do that. The Board of Directors meetings and committee meetings are open to the public but are not public meetings. School district residents who wish to make public comment should sign in prior to the start of the meeting and request to speak during public comment. Sign-in forms can be found in the back of the room or in the vestibule. Please fill out your name, address, and whether you plan to speak on an agenda item. While there are 2 public comment sections on our agenda, you may only speak at one. The first section is for agenda-related items only. When called to the microphone, please state your name and township for the recording of the official meeting minutes. As a reminder to all in attendance this evening, all public comments are to be limited to 5 minutes in length. As per our board policy 903, all statements shall be directed to the presiding officer. No participants may address or question board members specifically. The board is not obligated to respond, but if board members choose to do so, they are to also address their comments according to Robert's rules to the presiding officer and refrain from addressing or questioning individual public commenters. The goal of public comment is to focus on the issues. We are made better through open dialogue and constructive discourse. We are grateful for the dedication of the public to our school district, and we will welcome comments at this time. So at this time, as I said earlier, the 2 people whose paperwork I had at the time did not sign in to speak. Are there any people in the audience that would like to speak on an agenda-related item at this time? Okay. So hearing no one, we will move on to number 10, matters for which board action is required. This first section would be Mr. Smith. Okay. Yes, I'm going to defer to Mr. Gelsinger since he is in the room. And
I'm
I,
gonna check and make sure he's still there. Are you still with us, Mr. Smith?
Yes, but somebody else can read that part if that would be all right.
Okay, thank you.
I'll
thank you,
make a
Keith.
motion for items. Does anybody want anything pulled out? So I'll make a motion for items 10A in its entirety.
I have a motion from Mr. Gelsinger. I have a second from Ms. Bauer. Any comments from anyone? Okay,
All it was leaves and a couple employment, so no retirement.
Mr. Mummert, roll call vote, please.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mrs. Brennan,
Yes.
Mr. Galzella,
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mr. Leidy,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes,
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes,
8 yes, 0 no.
thank you. Moving on to 10B, Finance and Support Services Committee. This is Mrs. Bauer.
Thank you very much. So for 10B, item number 1, the recommendation to approve the 2023 to 2024 budget transfers in the amount of not $945,000. Was Mr. Furman going to speak to this item?
Yep.
Thank you.
Second.
We have a motion from Ms. Bauer, a second from Mr. Leidy, and then
Discussion.
comment.
I laid a packet at everyone's place. It was also included in Agenda Manager, but I figured I'd print a packet for you. Just make sure everybody we're looking at the same thing. This is a process we go through every year. It's part of the audit process. It's part of the financial statement finalization. Actually, we're at that point where the auditors are finalizing the financial statements. You'll see page 1 is actually one of the statements in the financial statements, and it's just for the general fund. And what it does is it looks at our budgeted numbers versus our actual numbers. So you can see there on the top, it talks about, shows the revenues, shows what our budgeted numbers were, what the actuals were for different categories. Then about a third of the way down, you'll see expenditures, same thing, budgeted expenditures and actual expenditures. And you'll see in the far right column, which is the variance, you'll see a lot of those variances are negative, which means we overspent our budget in that category. Some we underspent, some we overspent. So that's what we're talking about, is the transfers to get those negatives into a positive balance. So if you turn to page 2, the $945,000 that Mrs. Bauer talked about, you'll see there where we're transferring money in and transferring money out of different functional areas equals $945,000. We're transferring monies out of regular programs. They were under budget. We're transferring money out of other instructional programs, again, under budget. And you'll see the others on there. And on the right-hand side explanation, I show just some idea of what was under budget in those areas, why we had some money left over that we could take money out of those functional areas, transfer it over to cover the other areas. If you look at page 3, once we make those transfers, once the board approves that and we can make those transfers, you'll see that we have our original budget column. This is just for expenditures, and then a final budget column, which is changed. And what that does is then on the far right-hand side, our variances are positive, except for a couple of different areas, which we did overspend the budget in, and we don't have any money to cover that area. And I have some explanations further on of why we overspent some of those areas. Any questions on those 3 pages for now? If we go on to pages 4 and 5, here's where some explanations come into play as to why we were over budgeted in an area, what caused that. I'm not going to go through all of that in detail. You can read through that. If you have any questions on it, please let me know. I will point out at the top, special programs, I see it says see explanations below. I will explain that one below a little more detail. But again, you see there some tuition reimbursements, some staff salaries were budgeted in one area, was actually spent in another area. That happens almost every year. When we go through the budget, we put money under regular programs for a lot of the degree changes, things like that. Well, that might not happen. That teacher might actually be in a different area that's budgeted for. So that's why the changes occur. Again, go down through those. Just some different, some of our federal expenditures, we don't really budget for those because we don't know what those expenditures are going to be, but we offset that with revenues coming in to cover them. So again, that's some of that you'll see for Title I expenses under $3,300 for community programs. About, again, a third of the way down there, you'll see special programs. That is one area that we overspent, and we can't cover that overspent expenditure. And I do have some explanations there. Salaries were a big part of it. We all know that we hired a lot of paraeducators last year, or a lot of PCAs last year. That was part of that. We had our, the one thing you'll see there is actually a negative, our LIU Schedule A payments. What happens there is we budget all of that in the 1200 function, but some of that actually has to be covered under like 2400 for health, the health function. It's the way we budget for it. It's the way those numbers come in from the LIU, how that all occurs. You'll see our tuitions under special programs, $700,000 over budget. We try to capture that every year, but not knowing what students are going to be here, what students are going to need to be placed at a different area, different location, and what those costs are going to be, it's always hard to calculate that. The other thing that you'll notice down there is student transportation under 2,700. We were also over budget in that area, and a large majority of that was contracted transportation. We know we don't have enough drivers, so we have to contract out. You'll remember, I hope you'll remember, the 24-25 budget, we did up that considerably, knowing that we were probably going to be over budget in 23-24. So 24-25, we hopefully will cover that. Even at that, we're not sure if we're going to cover it this year because those expenditures are even higher this year. So we use this to look at the data, look at the budget. So we're going into budget discussions here in a couple of months. We'll use some of this data to say, okay, we need to increase our budget for those areas coming up for 25-26.
I'm sorry, Doc, didn't we already bake in TransFinder software before this fiscal year?
TransFinder last year we implemented it last year in April, I think it was. We had to pay a cost for that. So we were paying for that TransFinder software a year before it was actually implemented. So we had to
Okay.
pay for a cost last
So
year.
we're a year
20 So
ahead.
we were paying for actually two softwares last year. We were paying for the old software that we were using. Then we had to pay for TransFinder to start the implementation in April. So it was up and running by August.
Okay, thank you.
So that's why we have the two costs in there for that. The other thing I'd like to point out down there at the bottom, the transfers, you'll see 2,992,000 for ESSER transfers. We received ESSER money this year for the high school project for the HVAC system. We have ESSER money set aside for that. That money came into the general fund, but we need to transfer that out to the capital projects fund because that's where the checks were cut from. So that's why you see that large transfer there. I just wanted to point that out. That's a pretty big number. So I wanted to point that one out to you. Any questions on those two pages? And we'll discuss a lot of this in a little more detail when we get to the budget discussions. We'll go through that and probably this information, even a little bit more information of why we were over budget last year. So we'll go through that. And then the last page, I just wanted to show you some reasons why our revenues, the budget transfers don't have anything to do with revenues, but our revenues were over budget by $7 million, which is a good thing. But I just wanted to show you, just give you some detail as to why we were in that situation. Again, you look at the federal programs at the bottom, that ESSER round 2 and round 3, that's that transfer I was talking about for the HVAC system. But then you can see also, you can read the other items there, real estate taxes, interim taxes, basic ed subsidy was much higher than what we anticipated. So those are just some reasons why the revenue side was higher than anticipated. Any questions on any of this? And the auditors will be here at the planning meeting to present the financial statements in January. So just to give you a heads up, she'll try and go fast through that.
Any other questions in reference to what Doug presented? Or are we ready to move forward with the vote? Okay, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Galzella,
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mr. Leidy,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
7 yes, 0 no.
I'm going to move on to item 10B2. It's a recommendation to approve a contract with SWSD Training Systems, develop and implement a training program for the football team, very similar to ones that have come across our desk in the past.
Second.
I have a motion for Mrs. Bauer and a second for Mr. Plessick. Any questions? As Ms. Bauer said, we've done this one before. All right, roll call, please.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mr. Leidy,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mr. Galzella,
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
7 yes, 0 no.
And then item 10B3 is no specific action. It's just if anyone has any discussion or any questions related to the long-range capital plan that was overviewed on the November 11th meeting.
So I just had one, and I kind of hit that with the feasibility study, and that is, I'd like our long-range capital plan to include some sort of accounting to doing an intermediate addition to Park Hills instead of a freestanding building. I know you baked in a freestanding building, but I didn't see anything specific to what it would cost to do a intermediate addition kind of,
So we have in those cost estimates, a 12,000 square foot addition.
right?
So, and it's based on a cost per square foot. So these numbers can be modified very easily. Just
Okay.
tell us the number of square footage that we're going to have, we'll readjust the numbers.
Okay.
So it's, from my standpoint, what we're looking at is trying to put forth numbers to give us an idea of what the cost is going to be to borrow money and what potential taxes we're going to have in place in order to support that cost. So we can make those adjustments relatively easily based upon the direction. Keep in mind, this is done prior to the feasibility study, so we don't even
Right.
know what they're going to be recommending. So we can make adjustments once that is completed.
Thank you.
Anything else? Seeing none?
Okay, moving on to the program committee. Mr. Beard is the chairperson for this. I had asked Mr. Gelsinger early this evening to take care of this, and now you got double roles, Mr. Gelsinger.
Sure. I'll make a motion for item 10C1.
Second.
This is simply a client services agreement between Soliant Health and Southwest School District for a billing rate of $116 per hour. I will remind everybody that that's all inclusive. That was one thing I pulled out of that contract, so that includes everything for 37 and a half hours per week. I'm assuming we have already designated a space for this person to work in because this is dated back to September 20th. So here we are approving something that has already been in process since September.
This was, they were working through the contract with the solicitors, and it's a telepsych, so it's virtual. But if they need to come in and do any work, we would provide the office space for them to do that.
We've had this one before as well.
Correct, but there were some additional modifications to the contract.
There were changes to the contract. Okay.
So there's no
'Cause I
additional
remember-
space because they're
I remember
existing,
putting it
right?
through
Yeah.
before.
Correct.
Okay.
Now, if they do come in, we can provide them space if necessary.
It looked like the contract was giving them a required 37 hours. Are they utilizing all of that or are they?
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay, we will, all right. Sounds like we probably
And
need
then
more than
some,
that.
sounds like it.
All right. And we're gonna pay an overtime over that.
This only authorizes them 37 and a half
That's
I
weeks.
thought it was a minimum,
No, that's,
said a minimum of 37, and there was opportunity for more, I thought.
Well, obviously, there's other psychologists. This isn't the only one, so we could balance it other ways, but if necessary, I don't imagine they would be opposed to if we requested additional services not to provide them.
At this time, though, you think the 37 should be sufficient, but
I-
we will be needing all of it.
But we will definitely be needing all of
Okay,
it.
all right. All right. That answers it.
Okay, hearing nothing else, roll call vote, Jeff?
Mr. Lady,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mr. Galzella,
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger,
yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
7 yes, 0 no.
Okay, moving on to 10D, Buildings, Grounds, and Equipment Committee, Mr. Plessick.
Like to make a motion for 10D1, recommendation to approve the Southwest High School capital projects payments for 3 million, almost 50 or thousand.
I have a motion from Mr. Plessick, a second from Mr. Gelsinger. Any comments in reference to this agenda item? Okay, hearing none, roll call vote.
Can I delay that
Oh.
until we get Mr. Smith back on the
Oh,
line?
did he
or
get
just
cut off?
dropped?
Okay.
Are you back? Yep. All right, we got you. Not sure what happened there. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Okay, roll call vote on item 10D. Since I'm not sure when Mr. Smith dropped off, I am going to read it one more time for clarity purposes. This is a recommendation to approve the Southwestern High School capital project request to include payment of invoices. It lists two check numbers totaling a total of $3,048,584.48. Roll call vote.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mr. Galzella,
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mr. Lady,
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
7 yes, 0 no.
Thank you. Moving on to 10E, Student and Community Relations Committee, Mr. Lady.
I'd like to make a recommendation to approve 10E1, the recommendation to approve a tuition waiver for a 12th grade student.
Second.
I have a motion from Mr. Lady. I heard Ms. Bauer in my ear for the second. Roll call vote.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mr. Galzella,
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mr. Lady,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
7 yes, 0 no.
Next, I have a recommendation to approve 10E2, an expulsion agreement number 2024-2025-5, as discussed in executive session.
Second.
I have a motion for Mr. Lady, a second from Mr. Gelsinger. Roll call vote, please.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mr. Galzella,
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mr. Lady,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
No.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
6 yes, 1 no.
Next, I'd like to make a recommendation to approve 10E3, another expulsion 2024-2025-06.
Second.
Motion for Mr. Lady, second from Mrs. Bauer. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Galzella,
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mr. Lady,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
No.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Ms. Weaver.
Yes.
6 yes, 1 no.
Like to make a recommendation to approve 10E4, another expulsion agreement, 2024-2025-07.
Second.
Motion for Mr. Lady, second from Mrs. Bauer. When you're ready, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mr. Lady,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
No.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mr. Galazella,
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
6 yes, 1 no.
And finally, I'd like to make a motion to approve 10E5, a recommendation to approve the Southwestern Drama Club to use the auditorium on the listed Sundays in January and February.
Second.
I have a motion for Mr. Lady, a second from Mrs. Bauer. Any conversation?
Also looks like in March.
It's category A. That's all I had.
Okay, hearing nothing else, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Lady,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mr. Galazella,
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
7 yes, 0 no.
I'm sorry, and I have one more. Make a recommendation to approve 10E6 for the Mustang Girls Wrestling Program to attend a tournament.
Second.
I have a motion for Mr. Lady and a second from Mr. Plessick. Any conversation? Okay.
Looking forward to going.
Yeah, I was just gonna say their first meet was tonight, right?
Right?
That's wonderful. Or home, I guess I should say home meet was
Right.
tonight. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mr. Galazella,
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mr. Lady,
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
7 yes, 0 no.
Thank you. Moving on to 10F Policy Committee meeting. Mr. Galazella.
Thank you, Ms. Weaver. If there are no objections, I would start with 10F 1, 2, and 3 together. These have all been covered extensively in prior policy committee meetings. These are all our final adoptions, meaning they will go into effect upon final adoption. And that would be policies 824, 906, and 915. So I'll make a motion for that.
Second.
Motion for Mr. Galazella, second from Mr. Gelsinger.
And as I stated, we covered extensively. I don't think we need, I don't need any further discussions. Anyone else does?
Just thank all the parties involved in making all the changes because it was extensive after some of the committee meetings in the past.
Right?
Okay, hearing no other comments, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mr. Galazella,
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mr. Lady,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
7 yes, 0 no.
I'll take the next 3 individually because they're tentative in case there's any further discussion. 10F4 is a recommendation to approve 10 adoption of policy 918 parent and family engagement.
Second.
Recommendation by Mr. Gelsinger, second by Mr. Lady. Or I'm so sorry, I did not mean to say Gelsinger. Galazella.
It's close.
I apologize.
The other G.
The other one, and second by Mr. Lady. Correct for the record, I apologize.
And again, we covered it extensively. I don't believe we need to discuss it further if anyone wants to.
The changes have been made that we recommended, so that.
This was the changes that you worked with Dr. Seibel for, correct?
Correct.
Yes.
And this was covered in the meeting yesterday
Right.
and is available on YouTube for anyone who wants to review it.
Correct.
Okay, hearing nothing else, roll call, please.
Mrs. Bauer,
Yes.
Mr. Galazella,
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger,
Yes.
Mr. Lady,
Yes.
Mr. Plessick,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
7 yes, 0 no.
All right, moving on, 10F5, tentative adoption of policy, make a motion to adopt tentative policy 113.3.
Second.
Motion from Mr. Galazella, second from Mr. Gelsinger.
And again, as previously discussed, is some wording and other rearrangements we discussed in policy committee.
A lot of title changes. That was the one we changed for Dr. Smell's title was throughout that policy. So that was the main purpose. That one got redone.
Any other comments? Okay. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Gilzella.
Yes.
Mr. Gelsinger.
Yes.
Mr. Leidy.
Yes.
Mr. Plessick.
Yes.
Mr. Smith.
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer.
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
Yes.
7 yes, 0 no.
And lastly, 10F6 is a recommendation to approve tentative adoption of policy 711. I make a motion.
Second.
Motion from Mr. Gilzella, second from Mr. Gelsinger.
And I'll stress that, do you want me to cover that?
Absolutely.
Okay,
It's, you're the
um,
chairperson, go right ahead.
So this tentative adoption, we will not be proceeding to a final adoption until all our renovations are done at the elementary school. So, I'm sorry,
Middle school.
yes, middle school, not elementary school. So this is a tentative adoption that we reserve we will extend as long as needed before going to final adoption to ensure all the renovations are complete prior to final adoption.
And point of information, that means that this does not go into place, which means that doesn't change any existing policy or procedures that are in process until final. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Anything? Okay. So in last week, after being made president of the board, I reached out to the ILC, as I am their contact person. I have spoken with them in reference to this policy that it would be coming up this evening. They have asked me to read the following statement. The ILC has indicated in conversation that policy 711 should not go up for adoption prior to the bathroom privacy renovations being complete. At this time, the Euro walls that will provide full privacy have not been delivered or installed, and therefore the policy should not go into effect yet. So on behalf of the solicitor who is helped to write this policy, I wanted to read that.
Okay.
Any other comments? Okay. Hearing none. Jeff, roll call vote, please.
Mr. Gelsinger.
Yes.
Mr. Leidy.
Yes.
Mr. Plessick.
No.
Mr. Smith.
Yes.
Mrs. Bauer.
Yes.
Mr. Gilzella.
Yes.
Mrs. Weaver.
No.
5 yes, 2 no.
That brings us to item 10G, other matters for board consideration and/or action. Anything else for anybody right now? Okay. That moves us on to section 11, which is our visitors section. As I read earlier, prior to the first section of public comment, I would ask that the same things, same guidelines be followed in this section. As I referenced, there were 2 in the agenda. So at this time, does anyone in the audience, would anyone in the audience, excuse me, like to come up and address the board? That's okay, I can take it. I appreciate you filling it out. So for the purposes of the video as well as the meeting minutes, would you please repeat your name and the township? We do have your address on file.
Absolutely. I am Nancy Mart and I live in Penn Township. And I know, as you said, this is not a question and answer session, but I do have 2 questions that at some point, maybe we can get around to answering, whether it's after the meeting or in emails or whatever. I was wondering when yesterday's meeting, when and where that was announced, published. It wasn't a scheduled meeting on the website, so I wasn't really sure what happened with that. And then my other question is simply, what's happening with the chairs? We've lost 2 rows back here. Are we going to continue losing them? I know you can't answer that. All right. To paraphrase words spoken at the November 6th board meeting, I went to bed ecstatic after the December 4th reorganization meeting. The board voted who it thought was appropriate into the presidency, and with that, I welcome Mrs. Weaver's election to that. Those of us who know Robert's rules know the president has no more authority or power than any other member, nor do the rules expect the president to be anything other than impartial. Roberts also expects decency and professionalism from the entire board, to each other, the teachers and students they serve, and the community they work for. Nowhere in Roberts does it say board members represent only those who voted for them, or worse, only themselves. We are at a position where teachers are leaving the district and students are frightened and uncomfortable with the small-minded and prejudiced policies that have been put in place. I know that as one person and just reorganization, there's not a lot that's going to change, but I am looking forward to a more polite, less condescending tone to the meetings under Mrs. Weaver's stewardship. And I hope the newly reorganized board can work together to make changes for the benefit of all students and staff. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to address the board? Okay. For clarity purposes, I do have the answer to one of those questions because I myself wanted to make sure that that was done correctly as well. There was a press release sent to the Evening Sun that ran on Sunday. The LED light board outside, because I drove by it just to make sure, did advertise the policy committee meeting in advance, as well as on the agenda manager of our website. It was also posted in advance. And I did double check that with Stock and Leader to make sure that that was sufficient. And I was told that that did meet the requirements of law. So for the clarity of that sentence, or the clarity of that question, I wanted to be able to provide that. Dr. Burkhart will handle the answer of the chairs.
We forgot.
That we were having a meeting?
Well, we would pull them out if they were necessary, but fortunately, there's less cleanup now. So
I was gonna say, this room gets changed around all the time. In fact, after the meetings, you might see us cleaning up over here a lot. This room has all kinds of different meetings in it. And so the chairs kind of come and go depending on what they think they might need. And so next week, you might come and, well, we hope we're not here next week, but in January, you might come and we might have 6 rows if we feel like it's necessary.
Anyone else?
Just thank Mr. Smith for dialing in and fighting through his flu tonight. So thanks
Yes.
for dialing in and fighting through it.
Thanks, Matt.
I do appreciate
No
everyone
problem, guys.
making the effort. Before I make a motion to adjourn, I just would like to reiterate a very happy holidays to all of you. If you're traveling, be safe and enjoy your family time. And we are grateful for your time this evening. At this time, unless anyone has anything else they'd like to add, I'd like a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Okay. Mr. Galazella was the motion. Mr. Gelsinger was the second. You two paired up a lot tonight. That worked out. Meeting adjourned at 8:36. Sorry, I have to.
Thanks, Matt. Gotcha.
27.